La da 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 da. La da 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 da. Hello. I've been outside. We've got lovely snow. We've got about 6 inches in front of my house so far. It's lovely. It doesn't pack worth diddly squat. And on account of that, you can't make an igloo. I said to myself, what am I going to do with the rest of my day? And I came up with a really cool idea to make a YouTube video for you. In this YouTube video today, I will show you all sorts of really cool things. It's very much a how-to YouTube video. Among other things, I will show you how to foment rebellion, overthrow the French colonial regime, liberate yourself from slavery, all sorts of other really cool, exciting things, all in a matter of 45 minutes, 50 minutes tops. Now, when you go to give a lecture to a normal class, you've got students that are listening. They ask questions. You see their eyes light up. Sometimes you see them fall asleep. Notwithstanding all of that, it gives you an audience to play off of, and that is important when you give a lecture. Now, I don't know where you are watching this. I'm guessing many of you are in your dorm rooms or apartments, or maybe you're not even watching it at all. I needed an audience. I improvised. I came up with something of a captive audience. Let me introduce you to two of my children. They are so excited to be here for this wonderful lecture. Look at them! Two lovely children. Annika on her left, Lars on his right. Oh, they're even got stuff to take notes with. Show me your notes. Oh, Annika's got notes. I need to play outside. Oh, dear. And Lars has a note. Oh, they look so happy to be here. I'm guessing they may feel a little bit like you feel right now that you find out that I've done this YouTube video. That being said, let's jump in and begin today's lecture. In terms of that, I want to introduce you to this second part of the course. And in many ways, today's lecture in many ways is a transitional lecture where we go from part 1 of the course to part 2. And to give you a sense of that, why don't you go ahead, take out your syllabus, or better yet, I will take out your syllabus for you. Here, take a look at this. Okay, today's lecture, Slavery and the Rights of Man, Saint-Domingue and the Haitian Revolution. You can see it here for February 16th. It's really a transitional lecture, and it takes us from part 1 of the course into part 2. And to do that, I want to give you just a little bit of logic, a sense of the logic of how everything is set up. Part 1 is entitled Race, Imperialism, and Faith, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Early Modern Era. And in Part 1, up to now in the course, we've established a series of European empires in the Atlantic and other places as well. The Spanish, the Portuguese, we've brought in the French in Brazil, the Dutch, the English we brought in last week. And as we've done this, we've looked at various issues involving race and involving imperialism, of course, but also involving faith as well. We're essentially establishing a foundation. Part 2, we will also comparatively look at a series of different European empires, but we'll look at how they're dismantled. And so you can see here it's called the Tribulations of Abolition and Independence. And so in this case, we'll look at the French in the Caribbean. We'll look at the British West Indies. This part of the course here, we'll look at Brazil. Over here, we'll look at the Spanish in the New World, including the Caribbean, including South America as well. Essentially, we're dismantling the empires that we established during the first part of the course. Well, a major point that I want to make in terms of today's lecture is that what happens in the French Caribbean in the late 18th century and what happens in France itself will be hugely influential and will be connected in all sorts of different ways to other parts of the Atlantic world in the decades that follow. And so keep in mind today that what happens in Haiti, what happens as well in France, influence events in the Iberian world, in the Spanish America, in Portuguese America, in North America in terms of what is today the United States as well. There are all sorts of connections. So keep this in mind as we move forward in the weeks ahead. In doing so, today we'll cover a bunch of different terms, and I've laid them out for you here just as I normally would on the board. As we come to these terms in the lecture, what I'll do is I will stop, and or I won't stop, but I'll have them appear on the screen so that you can see how to spell the term. But here they're all laid out for you here. You may want to pause for just a moment so that you can You can write them all down. I am not going to pause. I'm going to move on. I want to give you a sense of where all of this is taking place in terms of today's lecture. And we're going to begin really where we began in the Atlantic with the island of Hispaniola, which is where Christopher Columbus established the Spanish seaborne empire in the Caribbean. In our case today, we're specifically going to be looking at the western third of the island, and you can see that laid out right here. What today we know as Haiti at the time was Saint-Domingue. And so let us go to Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century. And to that end, let us begin in late 1790. A French colonist in the colony of Saint-Domingue by the name of Labarre wrote home to his wife in France, describing, among other things, African slavery in what is today Haiti, Saint-Domingue of this era. And this is what he writes. He says, "There is no movement among our Negroes. They don't even think of it. They are very tranquil and obedient. A revolt among them is impossible. The Negroes are very obedient and always will be. We sleep with door and windows wide open. Freedom for Negroes is a chimera, an illusion," and so forth. Well, he writes this in late 1790. Less than a year later, August 1791, marks the beginning of what we today know as the Haitian Revolution. It's the largest slave rebellion in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Eventually, it will lead to the establishment of a free black republic, the Republic of Haiti. Questions that we'll deal with today. Number one, how did this happen? Number two, why were the region's French whites so quick to underestimate, really, the strength and the unity of the African slaves in Saint-Domingue? Well, in order to answer this question, these questions, we must briefly trace, really, the history of Haiti from its beginnings all the way through the late 18th century, this point in time where the Haitian Revolution begins. So, to do that, let's go back to our map again, where we're talking about the French Caribbean, Saint-Domingue. All right, returning to our map, I want to just give you a quick little bit of background in terms of the history of Saint-Domingue, the colony of Saint-Domingue, that you'll need in terms of making sense of all of this. And again, on our map, you can see Saint-Domingue laid out here, what is essentially today the country of Haiti. But in terms of that, Haiti is the name given today to the western third of the island that Columbus had originally named Hispaniola, that often was called as well Santo Domingo. The Spanish controlled the island over the course of the 16th century, as we've talked about before. By the beginning of the 17th century, the 1600s, however, the French, the English, the Dutch had begun to make inroads into the region, frequently through pirates and privateers. In 1606, in response to this, Spain ordered the island's Spanish inhabitants to move closer to the capital city of Santo Domingo to consolidate their power against the depredations of foreign powers. The decision, of course, left the uninhabited parts of the island open to the very pirates that the Spanish were protecting against. And groups of Dutch, French, English pirates begin to establish bases along the northern and the western portions of the island. So essentially this area here. Building off of these early settlements, the French crown would formally begin to colonize the western portion of the island in 1625. And in 1664, France declares itself sovereign of the western portion of the island. Of course, it's one thing to declare sovereignty. It's quite another to actually have it recognized by others. It would be nearly half a century before France's de facto sovereignty would be recognized by Spain. And this recognition was actually part of the Treaty of Ryswick, which was between a variety of European powers, Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, and so forth, in 1697. And among other things, it specified that the French would have sovereignty over the western portion of Hispaniola. Well, translating the Spanish name of what is today the island's capital, what was then often a term used to refer to the island, Santo Domingo, the French will name their portion of the island Saint-Domingue. Well, while the Spanish portion of the island will begin really to decline over the course of the 16th century into the 17th century and so forth, the French portion of the island will very, very much thrive. Thrive in power and prosperity over the course of the 17th, especially over the course of the 18th century. By 1785, Saint-Domingue is arguably the richest colony in the New World. In this regard as well, it would of course become France's most important colony during this period of time as well. And significantly, from the very, very beginning, Saint-Domingue's riches are very much linked to slavery. Besides Brazil, Saint-Domingue will be the colony that has the largest market for slaves in the New World. More slaves are going to Saint-Domingue than anywhere else, with the exception, as I said, of Brazil. In terms of this, social relations on in Saint-Domingue very, very much will revolve around slavery. So let's take a moment. I want to talk a little bit about the racial dynamics that exist on Saint-Domingue over the course really of the 17th into the 18th century. And to begin, we must speak of something called the Code Noir of 1685. Code Noir essentially is a term that simply means the Black Code. It's a series of laws or regulations that were enacted in 1685 by the French to govern race relations on the island. And from the very beginning, this Code Noir is very much geared towards helping the French populate and control the island. In order to effectively claim sovereignty over the island, not just some legal claim, but de facto control, the French needed to populate it in earnest. And they very much struggled to do this in the early periods of time, middle of the 17th century, early 17th century, and so forth. In part, the solution to this dilemma was the Code Noir of 1685, which granted automatic manumission to various groups of African slaves. This will have various consequences. To begin, it will increase then the number of blacks or of mulattoes, an in-between kind of group that are neither whites nor enslaved Africans. It'll increase the population of this group significantly after 1685. This group in French is referred to as gens de couleur. I'm going to translate that into English as the free people of color. So after 1685, the number of free people of color will increase dramatically, and this initially helps the French to populate the island. That being said, as the number of free people of color increase, the French whites begin to become fearful. In 1720, in response to these fears, they stop the process of automatic manumission for certain groups. The fear here among the whites is that they're already outnumbered by the blacks, slaves, African slaves. Now they're going to be outnumbered by a second group, these free people of color. Notwithstanding this measure in 1720, other attempts to curb the population of the free people of color, their numbers will continue to increase. Among other things, it's thought that they often had very, very large families. I can give you a sense of this in terms of the passage of time by looking at a slide that shows you the population across these different groups in Saint-Domingue over the course of this period of time. And here you can see a table of the population of French Saint-Domingue between the years 1681 and 1789. And what I want to highlight for you here is, in this instance, the increase in your white population. And here you can see you start out with roughly 4,000 whites, 210 free people of color, these so-called gens de couleur, and roughly 2,000 slaves. Well, your white population will increase over the course of the next 100 years. By 1789, there's nearly 30,000 French whites in Saint-Domingue. You see, your free people of color, which starts out very, very small, will significantly increase in the decades that follow. By 1789, you've got 27,000, nearly the same number of free people of color as you do French whites at that point in time. Well, in terms of just some additional background on the free people of color, they could own and run their own shops, and so among other things, they're acquiring capital. In terms of this as well, they could own their own slaves and as well as their own plantations. French whites, in terms of this, frequently already had really the monopoly on sugar production. Free people of color would frequently make their money in terms of plantations with coffee, slavery, and coffee. Among other things, in terms of the capital they would acquire, they often saved their money up, and as they acquired more and more capital, they would be in a position to lend it out to supply credit. Who are they supplying credit to? Often to the French whites of the island. Also, in terms of the capital, they frequently send their children off to France to be educated. It was said at the time that often the children of the free people of color would return to the island being better educated than their white counterparts. Well, in time, whites will begin very much to resent this rising middle group. And you see this, among other things, in terms of the laws that are enacted in Saint-Domingue. Between 1758 and 1789, French whites will enact a series of laws that are meant to keep the free people of color down. Among others, laws that prevent free people of color from holding office. Additionally, in time, free people of color would be prohibited from going to France, from sitting down with whites at dinner, from wearing certain fashions, from staying out late at night. That is to say, they had a kind of a curfew. All sorts of limitations, although I should point out the whites did not prevent the free people of color from lending them money. They were happy to use their credit and their capital. Well, let's go back to our slide real quick. Look once more in terms of the free people of color, and then I want to look beyond this group, beyond the white group, to a third group. What of the African slaves? Well, coming back to the table where we're at, we've already looked at the case of the French whites. You can see here, the free people of color here. The big group, I mean the really, really big group, is of course your African slaves that are laid out here. And you can see you start out in 1681 with 2,000. This number will skyrocket in the decades that follow. And as I said before, really, Saint-Domingue becomes the second largest market for the African slave trade over the course of this period of time, second only to Brazil. Brazil, of course, is huge in size in comparison to this little tiny portion of an island. But you start out with 2,000 in 1681 roughly. You can see the number skyrockets. By 1789, you have 465,000 African slaves in Saint-Domingue. Nearly 500,000 African slaves. In terms of numbers, they are the largest demographic group. They outnumber the free whites, the free people of color. Put together, they nearly outnumber them 10 to 1. Not quite, but nearly. And so what of this third group? What of the African slaves? Well, in terms of some quick background on African slavery in Saint-Domingue, to begin, it was very, very brutal. We've already talked about sugar plantations in Brazil. Brutal. You've got the same labor regime going on in Saint-Domingue. It's brutal, it's difficult. Arguably, you could say the same of African slavery, really, anywhere in the Americas, but particularly in places where sugar was the cash crop. So there are all sorts of dangers, high mortality rates, and so forth. In response to some of this, in 1785, the French crown will create a second Code Noir, a second black code, among other things, in order to help alleviate the lot of black slaves whose lives were extremely difficult. Among other things, the new Code Noir specified that slaves could keep garden plots, that they could also acquire capital of their own by raising their crops, selling them at the market, and so forth. Additionally, it specified that slaves could contest the behavior of their masters, even take them to court if they were abused. This gives you a sense of attempts by the French crown to alleviate the lot of these African slaves off in the New World. The slaves themselves, of course, also would very much take matters into their own hands. And this brings us to the story of Haitian voodoo. We'll talk more about Haitian voodoo as the class progresses. During the second half of the course, we'll talk about it in terms of the 20th century. Let's talk about the origins of this syncretic religious tradition, Haitian voodoo. Over the course of the colonial period, the slaves in Haiti will develop a syncretic religious tradition that we know today as voodoo. And I've spelled it out for you here. You'll actually find all sorts of variant spellings on this. Voodoo, what is it? Well, it's based on a merging of beliefs and practices of West African peoples with Roman Catholicism, which is, of course, the African ideas are brought by the African slaves who would come to Haiti in the 16th, the 17th, the 18th century, and who then are forced to convert to the religion of their owners, the French Catholicism. whilst they largely still continue to follow their traditional African beliefs. Well, as generations pass, you really end up with a melding of these religious traditions. African traditions on the one hand, traditions from Roman Catholicism on the other. The principal belief in Haitian voodoo is that there are various deities, or loa as they are called, who are subordinate to a greater God who does not interfere in human affairs. Therefore, it is to the loa that voodoo worship is directed. And in this regard, the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution is traditionally said to have originated with a legendary voodoo ceremony that was said to take place in the north of Saint-Domingue in late August of 1791. Before we can talk about that ceremony, however, the legend behind it and so forth, we need to go back to Europe, to France more specifically, because events in the old world at this point in time will have a profound influence on events in the new. So let's leave Haiti behind for the moment. Let's go off to Europe, to France, in the late 1780s. And among other things, I want to talk about the French Revolution. Well, in 1788, the French king, who is the king of France at this point in time, it is Louis XVI, is forced to call the Estates General together on account of general unrest among the larger French population. The Estates General is a kind of representative parliament. In large part, he had to convoke it, Louis XVI, because of the demands of the so-called Third Estate, the people who want to participate in government. They want to have a greater say in terms of the government of their day. The Estates General is convoked in 1788. Well, that's what's going on in terms of France. In the Caribbean, the French Caribbean, white planters are also demanding that they have representation at court. In response to this, the Crown will give all property owners the right to vote. Well, in the Caribbean, there's a special context here that raises all sorts of questions. Does the right to vote for property owners pertain to free people of color? You remember, they have their own shops, they have their own slaves, they have their own plantations, they have their own capital. They own property. Are they now allowed to vote? Well, French whites in the New World say no, absolutely not. The free people of color say yes. Why do you have that right? You're a property owner. We are as well. We should be able to vote as well. Consequently, the free people of color will become angry. The whites will become angry. The two sides will begin to use their slave armies to fight one another. Meanwhile, off in Europe, after the Estates General have been called, fighting will break out there as well. What we today call the French Revolution will break out in France over issues of equality and freedom. French aristocrats will soon begin to lose their heads to the guillotine and so forth. So you've got fighting in the old world. You've got fighting now going on in the new world in terms of rights and on and on and on. Well, meanwhile, Saint-Domingue, African slaves begin to hear rumors that slavery will soon be outlawed, that everyone will become free. After all, the revolution in France is about issues, questions of equality and so forth. And in this regard, some come to believe that the French crown is instituting reforms on behalf of the slaves. These are the kinds of rumors that are making their way to the New World, that are spreading like wildfire across Saint-Domingue. Well, in reality, this is very, very far-fetched. The French king himself will ultimately be guillotined in the years that follow. It's all he can do to take care of himself, his family, the aristocrats in France, and of course he'll ultimately lose out on all of this as well. So he is not instituting reforms in terms of these slaves in the New World, but the slaves themselves come to believe, in part it's said this, there are all sorts of rumors. In the midst of this, late August 1791, a group of slaves were reputedly gathered together in the north of the country under the direction of a voodoo priest. The name of this priest is Duddy Bookman, and the place that they will gather will ultimately become legendary in Haitian lore. A place called Boy Kaman, or Kaiman. Again, I don't do French, but I've written it for you here. In terms of background, who is Duddy Bookman? Well, he was probably born in Jamaica, and it's thought that he was later sold by his British master to a French plantation owner. In French, the French name, Bookman, probably came from an English nickname, Bookman, B-O-O-K-M-A-N. The implication here is that he is literate, that he could read, that he could write, that he was a lettered man, that he was a bookman. Well, anyway, in terms of additional background, he's said to have been a giant, a powerful man. Some quotations indicate, I say quotations, comments of the time say that he was, quote, a grotesque-looking man with a terrible countenance, a face like an exaggerated African carving. Well, Bookman, together with a voodoo priestess, will reputedly lead a ceremony, a voodoo ceremony, as follows. A pig will be sacrificed, an oath will be taken, and Bookman will exhort his listeners, all African slaves, to fight bravely against their oppressors, concluding with the following prayer to the group's Loa, to their God. This is their prayer. The God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God who holds up the ocean, who makes the thunder roar, our God who has ears to hear, you who are hidden in the clouds, who watch us from where you are. You see all that the white man has made us suffer. The white man's God asks him to commit crimes, but the God within us wants to do good. Our God, who is so good, so just, he orders us to revenge our wrongs. It is he who will direct our arms and bring us the victory. It is he who will assist us. We all should throw away the image of the white man's God, who is so pitiless. Listen to the voice for liberty that sings in all our hearts. Well, days later, the Haitian Revolution will begin. Again, it's the largest slave uprising in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Soon after it begins, French authorities will capture Bookman. They will execute him by beheading. They go on to publicly display his head in an attempt to dispel the aura of invincibility that he had cultivated, and yet the attempt ultimately fails. The fighting will go on for the next decade and a half. A tremendous, really, amount of time. I want to give you some background in terms of the fighting that goes on. I'm going to pause for just a moment, let you catch up. Of course, I guess you can always just push pause on YouTube, but let you catch up in terms of your notes. And going forward, what we'll do is really, by way of conclusion, before I show you the pictures, divide the history of the Haitian Revolution up into really 3 distinct periods. And as I talk about them, I'll have some information appear maybe on the screen so that it gives you a sense of the periodization that we're talking about as I describe specific events. 3 general periods can be used to describe the larger Haitian Revolution by way of an outline. I'm going to give you some titles for these periods as well. The first period is roughly between the years 1791 and 1794, and I'm going to call this the period of imperial denial. The second period is what I'll call the period of imperial rivalries, and this would be roughly between 1793, 1794, and 1798. And then the final period is a period that I'll call Civil War and Aftermath. And this is the period between 1799 and 1804 when fighting finally comes to an end. So 3 distinct periods, again, imperial denial, 1791 to 94. Imperial rivalries, these are overlapping periods, 1793 to 98. And Civil War and Aftermath would be 1799 to roughly 1804. Well, let's start with the first, the period of imperial denial, 1791 to 1794. Although the revolts did great damage during this period, the whites keep control of the colony's major cities. They are sure that troops will soon arrive from France to help put this rebellion down. Meanwhile, however, in France, news of the insurrection allows reformers to insist that free people of color be granted their rights. The idea here was that this would ensure their support of French attempts to put the insurrection down. Let's get the free people of color on our side as we're fighting against these masses and masses of African slaves and all of the different rebellions, individual rebellions that are cropping up all over the place. What happens on account of this? When the French revolutionary regime seeks really the support of free people of color, this alienates the French whites. You've got all sorts of combinations, rivalries going on in the New World. In the fall of 1792, 3 French commissioners will arrive in Saint-Domingue from the increasingly revolutionary, reform-minded regime in France. So they arrive in the New World. The white planters immediately mistrust the commissioners, and so the commissioners will eventually find their greatest support among the island's free people of color. Eventually, the divisions between these two groups, between the whites and the free people of color, would become so great that the whites will launch an attack to seize control of what was then the island's major city, Cap Français. They want to take control of it from these 3 commissioners in June of 1793. Well, the commissioners, the free people of color, they are outnumbered. The commissioners themselves from France are in real danger of losing their own heads. One of the commissioners makes a very, very bold move. He calls on the black insurrectionists throughout the countryside to attack the city and keep it from falling into the hands of the conservative whites. And he makes a promise to the slaves. Those who fight on the side of the French revolutionary regime will be freed. This is the promise. The commissioner's promise will eventually culminate in a decree of August 1793 freeing the entire slave population in Saint-Domingue. And so by August of 1793, slavery has legally been outlawed in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue, by the French revolutionary regime. And this brings us really to then the second period in terms of the Haitian Revolution, the so-called period of imperial rivalries that go roughly between 1793 and 1798. During this period, the British will invade the island, attempting to have a say in its future. More importantly, in terms of the British, they're trying to hurt the French Empire overseas. By 1796, however, slave armies have largely defeated both the British and ultimately the armies of the French as well. And this brings us to a final period, the period of civil war, of aftermath, roughly 1799 to 1804. And during this period of time, you've got a great deal of fighting that goes on. It involves the spoils of war. Who's going to be in control of the island now that the French have been defeated, more or less defeated, now that the British have been defeated as well. Essentially different factions fighting over the spoils of war in the New World. In terms of these factions, there are really 2 that are very, very important. The first, the so-called Nouveau Libre, and I've spelled it for you here. Literally, this means the new free. And this refers, these are largely in the north in terms of this faction. They're led by a man named Toussaint Louverture, and essentially the Nouveau Libre are those who have recently been freed. People who were just before all of this fighting, African slaves, the new free, the Nouveau Libre. Who are they fighting against? Well, they are fighting against the so-called Ancien Libre. Ancien meaning the old free, a faction that essentially in many ways represents the free people of color who for generations in some cases had enjoyed their freedom in Saint-Domingue. And so really you've got fighting going on. The Ancien Libre in many cases with these free people of color are interested in reinstituting slavery and so forth. They're fighting against the Nouveau Libre, fighting against the free people of color and so forth. In the midst of all of this, the island's remaining French whites will largely flee the island. They'll be killed in the infighting and so forth. By 1800, Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Nouveau Libre, will have the upper hand. He will eventually write to France, and he'll ask that Saint-Domingue be allowed to become an autonomous province, part of a new French republic. In the midst of the fighting in Haiti and France, however, his letter will take a couple of years to arrive. When it does arrive in France, the radical wing of the French Revolution has largely consumed itself. It has been replaced by the conservative Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte isn't interested at all in having a province of free slaves in the New World. In 1802, Napoleon will send a French army to Saint-Domingue to win the colony back for France and to reinstitute slavery. In large part, the French army, when it comes, does not differentiate between the Nouveau Libre and the Ancien Libre, between these different factions that are fighting against each other, and really attempts to massacre both sides. This completely backfires for the French, because what it does is it brings together these different factions. They now have a common enemy to fight the forces of Napoleon. It unites them, it brings them together, the Ancien Libre, the Nouveau Libre, fighting together against the French. Toussaint Louverture will eventually be captured. He'll be taken back to France. This further serves to unite the island together against the French. Eventually, the island's armies, who have already defeated the revolutionary forces of France, the imperial forces of Britain, will defeat the forces of Napoleon himself. And having destroyed, conquered all of these different groups, they will declare the island's independence in the year 1804 and change its name from Saint-Domingue, a name in many ways that had been imposed by Europeans, by really Columbus, hundreds and hundreds of years before, with the establishment of a European empire in the Caribbean. They will change their name. They will no longer be called Saint-Domingue, Santo Domingo, if you will, in Spanish, but rather take upon themselves the name of Haiti, which was a Taino name, an indigenous name that meant the land of the high mountains. Well, I have a bunch of pictures I'm going to show you. You're still probably writing a bunch of different things down. I'll pause for a moment. We'll cut to the pictures. We'll come back at the end for some final thoughts in terms of the significance of all of this as well. But let me show you very, very quickly a series of pictures that speak to much of what we've talked about today. Let's begin with the story of the French Revolution itself. Begins in 1789, will last really for the next decade. Prior to this point in time, France had been ruled by, the monarchy for centuries and centuries and centuries, an absolute monarchy. Over the period of a decade, everything collapses. And part of that story is the story of the storming of the Bastille. You still celebrate Bastille Day today in France and so forth. This is an image that speaks to this. The image is actually a contemporary image from around 1789, this period of time that we're talking about, the storming of the Bastille. Well, the French Revolution will take various turns over the course of the next decade. Here you can see the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is approved by the National Constituent Assembly of France in late August of 1789. It affirms various rights: liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression, that certain groups like the aristocracy and others that had been exempt from taxes now have to pay them. All sorts of things are in this. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, the outlawing of arbitrary arrests, all sorts of things. This is the more kind of, we're beginning to take a turn towards what will ultimately become a very radical sort of thing, but here it's not so radical perhaps. Here you can see the much more radical signs of things. The government of Robespierre, as the French Revolution takes a very, very revolutionary turn. The king, the aristocracy, thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people end up losing their heads. And you can see it playing out here on the left in this, this French image. You can see the English making fun of the French on the right. Depictions of the French Revolution, of course, aren't just limited to this period of time. You can also find them today as well. I want to show you an image that speaks to this. Not an image, part of a movie, The Scarlet Pimpernel, that I used to watch as a boy.
Our Father, who art in heaven.
Well, if these are the events that are occurring off in Europe, people losing their heads and so forth, what happens in the New World is in many ways no less radical. So let's leave Europe behind for the moment. We'll leave France behind. Let's go off to the Caribbean, to the colony of Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, where you'd had free people of color, you'd have whites as well, French whites, fighting one another, using their slave armies to do so. Ultimately, the slaves themselves will rise up. And here are just some images, some depictions, really. This is a depiction of the Battle of Saint-Domingue. It's a painting that was done by a Polish painter, actually, in 1875. But it depicts a struggle between Polish troops in the French service fighting against Haitian rebels. And so here you can see that depiction here. A bloody sort of thing. Among other things here, you take a look, you can see this man has lost his head. Maybe events in the New World are not altogether different than those in France. Another image here, this is the Battle of Snake Gully. This takes place in 1802. It's described in various sources of the day, and here you can see a not really a painting, but an attempt to depict this. This was a picture that was published in Paris in 1825. Well, in terms of the characters in all of this, I talked a little bit about Toussaint Louverture. He will lead the Nouveau Libre. Eventually, he's in person one that unites all of these former African slaves, former free people of color, and others, all together, brings a sense of unity to what had previously been a lot of factional fighting. These images here depict him. Nobody knows for sure what Toussaint Louverture actually looked like. We don't believe that any of these images were done during his lifetime. Here's just a quick description. This was published in London in 1805. Someone who had been in Haiti, describing him, writes, "In person, Toussaint was of a manly form, above the middle stature, with a countenance bold and striking, yet full of the most prepossessing suavity, terrible to an enemy, but inviting to the objects of his friendship or his love." And it goes on from there. But here's Toussaint Louverture. Eventually, he'll be captured by the French. He will die. But his death serves to unite these different factions. You've got the African slaves rising up in rebellion, fighting all sorts of people. I mentioned already the revolutionary regime, the revolutionary French regime. They're fighting as well the British. And this is an image that depicts that. Here you can see Toussaint Louverture negotiating with the British. Essentially, the slaves will defeat the British army. Eventually, the slaves will have to deal with Napoleon's troops as well. This is an image that takes place after Napoleon's troops are in defeat. This is an image that actually is thought to have come from around 1805. But by this point in time, Toussaint Louverture is dead, and the Napoleon's troops are in retreat and so forth. They've left, but in doing so, they left devastation in their wake. How do the former slaves respond? Well, they take their prisoners of war that they had captured, these French whites, and they string them up and they hang them. And here you can see, this being portrayed in all sorts of different ways. It's images like this that will go on to really terrify whites all across the Atlantic, from Brazil all the way up to the American South. There are terrible fears that there will be somehow another Haiti, that the slaves in these places will rise up, massacre the whites. It's images like this that just will have a very long-lasting impression across the Atlantic. We'll talk about this over the coming weeks. I want to end these images with this one here. This is a statue you can see in front of in Port-au-Prince, in front of the presidential palace. This palace, by the way, you can see in the background, was actually destroyed several years ago by the great earthquake that destroyed so much of Haiti, and now they've rebuilt it. This is an image before that earthquake. And the statue itself is called the Black Maroon, and it speaks to the manner in which the runaway slave in many ways becomes the symbol for Haiti's republic, for its sovereignty for its independence from France, for the end of slavery itself. And so here you can see the black maroon. He's a runaway. In the back here you can see the chain is broken. He's been able to escape. He's got a machete that you can't really see very well, but it's right here. I'm pointing it out right here. His machete, and this is the conch shell that he uses to call his brethren to arms and so forth, a symbol of Haiti's sovereignty. I want to end by just reading you a little quick thing here, and in terms of the pictures. I'll come back in a minute in terms of the big picture of all of this, but with a comment that was made by a French legislator in 1797, speaks to the slaves themselves, like you see depicted here, and how they take the words and what they'd heard in terms of the French Revolution, and they turn it to their own ends. This is this French legislator writing in 1797 about the French Revolution and its effects in Haiti. He writes, "In the midst of the general exaltation of passions caused by the Revolution, when the word liberty was in everyone's mouths, even those of the white colonists who used it to claim tyrannical power and political independence for themselves." Here he's talking about the whites and the free people of color fighting against one another. "When the symbols of freedom were displayed everywhere, it would have been odd indeed if the blacks alone had been deaf to the sound of a word that promised them a condition so different from the one they were suffering under. They saw the whites fighting amongst themselves and alienating the mulattoes, that is to say, the free people of color. They outnumbered the whites 10 to 1. One would have to have a very poor understanding of human nature to think that in such a situation the blacks needed any inspiration other than this impulse that is irresistible for all living creatures." So I give you the Haitian Revolution, in this case, the black maroon. Well, let's cut from the pictures. I have just a few more comments I want to make in terms of the bigger picture of all of this. Well, I want to conclude with just some final thoughts in terms of the significance of all of this. First off, following independence, Haiti was fundamentally bound in terms of its future history to notions of freedom, freedom without slavery. This will become the basis for the island's national identity. It would also become the basis for the island's black identity. In Haiti, the island's blackness not only meant opposition to slavery in 1804, but also to colonialism more generally and to the idea of white superiority. In many ways, the Haitian Revolution, the emergence of a second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, implicitly condemned as immoral everything that had happened in the New World up until this point of time. So, what happens in Haiti is important. As we shall see over the coming weeks, what happens in Haiti will influence events all across the Atlantic, in Europe, in the New World, and everything in between. So, I will see you in class on Wednesday. I'm going to go outside and play a little bit again in the snow. I told you it doesn't pack, but there's a lot of it, and you can do a lot with snow. I take huge shovels full of it and use it when I'm having snowball fights with my children. In terms of my kids, I don't know how you handled the lecture, but they survived, although I don't know how happy they are to have been here the entire time. Let me show you what they look like. If you've made it this far, you made it further than they did. Here we have Annika. She's changed places with her brother. Oh, look at that smile. And here we have Lars. He's trying to keep from giggling. Lars! Lars! There he is. And there is his sister. And I think they're going to go outside and play. Lars might even get dressed for the day. We'll see. So, anyway, thank you for watching. I hope that you had fun in the snow, and I'm going to go play in it as well. You know what? I just had one final quick thought. You have sat through an entire lecture. If you've gotten this far, you should get a reward. When were your papers due? They were due on Wednesday, February 18th. As I told you, that meant send them to me before I wake up on Thursday, February 19th. I guess that would have been. why don't we put the papers off for a little bit, go and have a little bit of fun. Write as much as you can today. Enjoy the day in terms of your writing, but feel free to have a little bit of fun as well. Let's move the papers back and have them be due not Wednesday, but rather next Monday, a week from today. So go enjoy the snow, and thanks for watching.